Welcome to the exploration of consciousness.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the exploration of consciousness. I am your host, Matt Presti. It's good to be back with my guest today, jakE Klyczek, who wrote the book School World Order. His website is in the ticker at the bottom there, schoolworldorder.info. I had the privilege of meeting John at CauseFest in Nashville, actually Franklin, Tennessee. Compliments of Courtney and Courtney Turner and her podcast. And it was really great to meet John. And real quick, I'd just like to give a brief introduction. John Klyczek has an MA in English and has taught college rhetoric and research argumentation for over 8 years. His literary scholarship concentrates on the history of global eugenics and Aldous Huxley's dystopic novel, Brave New World. He is author of School World Order, The Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education, and is a contributor to Unlimited Hangout, New Politics, Center for Research on Globalization, and various others as well. His work has also appeared on What Really Happened in the SGT Report. He's been interviewed on several popular radio shows, podcasts reaching tens of thousands of listeners, and also is the director of writing and editing at Black Freighter Productions. So welcome aboard, John. It's nice to have you. Do you prefer to go by jakE for this podcast?
The jakE is a nickname my wife gave me. It's kind of an acronym that combines my initials and hers. And so you can call me whichever. If you're looking me up, the book is under the name John, but whatever you feel comfortable with is cool with me. You can even switch back and forth.
All right, sounds good. And I wanted you to give a little bit more of an introduction. I also see that you're a martial artist, and I have a personal affinity for martial artists. I did 9 years of ninjutsu in my teens and into my very early 20s, but I tend to find that martial artists are extremely disciplined and tend to populate this truth movement more. The ones that are the teachers, I should say, seem to have a martial arts background. So why don't you elaborate a little bit into that, if you would?
Yeah, just real quick. So were you under Stephen K. Hayes, under his organization?
Yes, okay. Dr. Masaki Hatsumi. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I a friend of mine that I used to train with back in the day, he trained under Stephen K. Hayes.
Excellent.
Yeah, there does seem to be a preponderance of martial artists in, I guess, what we might call the truth movement, or whatever term you want to give it. And I think maybe some of that has to do with the fact that in martial arts, in order to progress and in order to grow, you have to take an objective account of your own limitations in order to break through and to grow, right? So one of the most refreshing things about martial arts for me, being an academic, was Teddy Atlas calls, when you get in the ring, he calls it the ring of truth, because right, you can say whatever you want and you can believe whatever you want and you can think whatever you want about how good you are, but the truth comes down to, right, whether or not you can actually apply this, whether or not you can actually stop the opponent from doing what he intends to do to you. So conversely, in the world of like rhetoric and academics, there's a lot of semantics, right? And there's a lot of gish galloping and, the strategic use of fallacies to not just trick the opponent into believing that they lost, but also to trick themselves into believing that they won. But in the world of martial arts, as like Mike Tyson said, right, once you get punched, everybody has a plan or a theory or this mental construct, as you might frame it, until they get punched in the face, right? And then whatever you thought you could do, right, that comes crashing down. And at that point, you either have to accurately assess that, go back to the drawing board, and be disciplined enough to work on those shortcomings, and go through the the sweat and the suffering and the training that requires you to not just cultivate the technique, but to cultivate the willpower and the endurance to actually apply it. And so that's actually very readily transferable to the world of public discourse in the realm of civic discourse in terms of like rhetoric and deconstructing propaganda, in a towards the development of a free society.
It's well said. I mean, a lot of the and just for the lack of a better term, the leftist mentality is when you do get punched mentally, the common reaction is to scream at the sky. So
yeah,
but
and usually that involves right. So scream at the sky and then hope that government or some corporation or somebody's going to come and rescue you. Somebody's going to come and rescue you from that situation. But in the realm of martial arts, like in reality, right? Maybe the police, maybe someone will come save you, but in the meantime, right? Even if someone is coming, you still have to fend for yourself in that moment. And that's something that's not cultivated in the world
sure.
of discourse. Yeah.
And I think that really plays into modern education and where it's come from. That back in the day, the trivium, which is the grade school of basic understanding and thought, and then obviously into the quadrivium, which is the high school, you could say, of knowledge and the proper application of the intellect and abilities of man on his mental realm. But I really appreciate the conversations that we had at the Cause Fest, and this has led me to want to bring you on because I've been a fan of Charlotte Iserbyt's work for a long time, and I sent you a photograph, which I'll throw up later, but it's basically to say that when it comes to education, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. And I think education is really one of those primary roots, which is responsible for the situation we find ourselves in today. And that was what was so beautiful about Charlotte's work in the deliberate dumbing down of America, is being a senior policy advisor in the U.S. Department of Education, an insider, and a school board director. Not only that, she was a friend to you. Would you care to just expound upon that relationship and how she affected you as a mentor personally?
Oh yeah. So I wrote my first chapter was really just an article at first in that book. So what had happened was this is around slightly before the era of Trump. And there was a governor in Illinois, his name was Bruce Rauner, he was a Republican, and there was a situation where he was basically stalling on passing the budget. And I saw this as a ploy to push public institutions into private receivership. The guy was a big charter school proponent. There's actually a Rauner College Prep, which is part of the Noble network of charter schools. If you looked at his state addresses, he kept promoting things like cradle to career education, which is basically just workforce training or school to work. And then he also promoted a lot of public-private partnership stuff more broadly, right? Which sort of encompasses the broader school choice movement, which basically funnels public dollars into private edu corporations known as charter schools. And there's other things like vouchers, where basically you get federal or state public tax dollars, and you can take that money and you can subsidize either your own private tuition, or you could go to another charter school or maybe a community school or something like that. And so roundabout what had happened at the time was one of the departments where I worked, because basically it was about 90% federally funded, had to get shut down for a time, because if we don't get the state budget passed, they're not allowed to release the federal funds. So we couldn't get the money to fund the program. And so I hadn't really intended on writing about education, because I teach college, and figured, you don't want to poo-poo where you work, right? So I figured, maybe keep a buffer in that realm. But at this point, there was basically no buffer left, because the job was pretty much taken from me. So I figured, well, let let me write an article about this and let me build on a lot of the stuff that I had heard Charlotte Iserbyt expound upon in this book here. This is The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, which she wrote after she blew the whistle on something called Project BEST. So Project BEST basic education skills through technology. So she had worked for the Department of Education under Ronald Reagan. She was a senior policy advisor in educational research and improvement. And she found this document. I have a physical copy of it. You can actually get a copy of it on my database on my website. But she blew the whistle on this thing. And basically, it was everything that I saw coming to fruition, sort of manifesting through this privatization scheme that Rauner had been pushing. And so that involved, Project BEST was basically a program to set up public-private partnerships between basically government schools and education technology corporations in order to implement operant conditioning, which, in other words, psychological conditioning algorithms to train students for workforce development. And so obviously I just named, right, the whole public-private partnership part, which is the school of choice. There was the cradle to career. At the same time, I was working for an online tutoring company, and this online tutoring company let us know that IBM's Watson was going to pilot with us. So IBM, for people who don't know, it's an AI program. It can do everything from adaptive learning to other types of predictive analytics, and it does it for healthcare, finance, security, and education. And so basically what I inferred was that IBM's Watson was going to be it's going to co-pilot, which means it's going to data mine what I'm doing as far as how I tutor. And so basically every day I go and I tutor, I'm training this thing to replace me. So there was, right, at this moment in time, this flashpoint, all the things that I had heard Charlotte talk about and write about were sort of like popping up in a way that was like threatening my employment. So I wrote this article. It's called The Corporatization of Education. And she sent me an email. I had thought to send her a copy, but I wasn't able to find her email for some reason, even though it's readily available on her website. But couldn't pin it down. Back then, she actually had two websites. There was an old ABCs of Dumb Down, which might still be up. If you go on, it's like had like a background. It looked like a piece of notebook paper. But then she did this separate Deliberate Dumbing Down website. And then her son has a website as well. It's called AmericanDeception.com, which has a whole host of documents, a lot of the stuff that I have on my website, but also not just educational documents, a lot of history stuff. So she reached out to me, and at first I'm thinking like, this has got to be a virus or something, right? This has got to be a troll or something. This is not really her. And I was like, well, I got to respond. So I respond, and it's her. And, she said, great job, and, just keep up the good work. So what I did was that first article focused on the privatization or the corporatization, and then I slowly wrote a next article that focused on the workforce training aspect, and then I went into the behaviorist methods or the education psychology, then went into the data mining, and then went into a host of other technologies that we'll probably talk about. And then roundabout in 2020, my book was published in 2019. And there was a point around 2020, there was a couple people that wanted to shoot a documentary. It hasn't come out to this day, so I don't know whatever happened with it, but that happens sometimes. But they came to see. They had filmed with Charlotte. They went to see her, and I guess she had my book on the table, and they were like, "What's this?" And they were like, "Oh, this is School World Order. This is Jay Klyczek. Like, you got to interview this guy." So they came out to Chicago to interview me, and then they were like, well, we're probably going to go back up there. And they were like, if you've never been up there and met her, she's like, you should really do it. So I was like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So it was around September of 2020. I went up there and we did a little filming. And for people that don't know, it wasn't too long before that, Charlotte had a brain bleed. She had a stroke. So they had to do a surgery, and they cut a piece of her skull out about this big. And so she had recovered, but she would still have issues, right? So with sort of heart issues that would affect the brain and things like that. And she needed someone to kind of be there and hang out at the house and help, take her to the store. I vacuum and put the storm door or storm windows in, to put the snow tires on the car, clean out the garage, that type of stuff, put the air conditioning in and out. And, I stayed there for about a whole month and just really bonded, really had a really great time. Just hung out, got to pick her brain, got to dig through the library. And at one point, when I cleaned out the garage, she had 13 file cabinets. There's about 34 separate shelves that were filled with everything that she'd collected, at least since she'd gone to the Department of Education. But some of it actually predated that, because some of it was when she had done work with an organization called GEMS, was Guardians of Education for Maine. And it was, so for those that don't know, that was part of how she got into the Department of Ed, was because she had was elected for the school board in Maine. I think it was Camden. I think it was the particular area in Maine. And so she had all this stuff on education, but a lot of stuff on, she also worked for the State Department, for those that don't know. And so she worked in Middle Eastern affairs and in Soviet affairs at 2 different times. And so she had a lot of stuff on foreign policy and stuff like that as well. And so she gave me all of that. It's like 4 lobster crates filled that are probably as tall as me and this wide. And then when she passed away, I actually, I was there. I came down and I stayed with her for the last couple of weeks, kind of help out and everything. And then, and at that point, she gave me the whole library. So I've got like 1,000 books that she had, all sorts of stuff. And it's just a really magical time. And I was just super lucky. It was like, I'm writing this article and I'm thinking like, maybe she'd like to read the article, but I don't know that she would. And she reaches out, and then it's like, then it's like, man, it would be cool to meet her one day. And then you meet her, and then you live with her, and then you're there when she passes away, and then she gives you it. And it's just like, it's doesn't even seem real sometimes. But yeah, it was very, very special. Yeah.
That's an amazing account. We all have our mentors, either living or past, but they really do shape our lives in so many ways. But to get to meet one in person and actually live with them and help them, she's got a really interesting story too as a background. But her father and grandfather were both members of Skull and Bones, which I didn't know this until very recently, but I had to go back and obviously having watched your presentation, it was just an amazing thing to realize that even though she came from that background where, yes, her father and grandfather were indeed members of Skull and Bones, it's interesting to me why she almost seemingly did a 180, where most people would probably want to kind of protect that from the general public finding out or knowing about, or just the sheer secrecy of it all, how she wasn't warned by them never to say anything. Maybe she was, I don't know, but maybe you could give us a little background on that and how she gave and leaked the list of that membership to Professor Anthony Sutton, who then went on to write The Secret Establishment, an introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones, revealing this international plot.
Yeah, so when you were talking there, I figured I'd go and grab them. So these are the catalogs, right?
There you go.
And you can see that she cut them. Well, Sam cut them, but you can see in here, right? And if I don't know how good it is, I need a webcam. But if you get if you get Anthony Sutton's introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones, you can see that they're 100% facsimiles, but they're cut here because Sam, her son, this is one of the things that he scanned into American Deception. And so the story goes that Anthony Sutton, he had written a 3-volume series when he worked for the Hoover Institute. And I've got 2 of the 3 here, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. And the 3rd I want to get one day, but the cheapest copy I can find is like $700 for a used copy.
Wow.
I don't know. I'm going to assume they don't want us to read that one, because I think that's the one that got fired. And so basically, what he had discovered was that we had been funding the Soviets in such a way and providing the technology in such a way that they wouldn't have become the formidable adversaries that they became had we not done so. And so, this sort of he was incredulous in terms of like, so why would we do this, right? I mean, this entire Cold War in many ways could have been prevented had we not basically built up our enemies in this way. And so the Hoover Institute didn't want him to publish that. And the phrase that was given to him was, don't break your rice bowl, Anthony, meaning like, if you publish this, right, you're going to be persona non grata in academia. But he wanted to pursue his line of research. He wanted to pursue the truth, and he published this. And, it did get him booted from academia. And at this point, he sort of was wondering, who did I upset, right? Who are the, as Sam refers to them, who are the men behind the curtain, right? Patrick Wood, who wrote Trilaterals over Washington with Anthony Sutton, said that one of the people that was involved in his firing was David Packard. And David Packard, he was at one point, you think he was Assistant Secretary of Education, but right, this is one of the guys that formulated the Hewlett Packard Corporation, which is, by the way, a huge. They have two foundations, William and Flora Hewlett, and then the other Packard Foundation from the other family, and those philanthropies are heavily invested in education technology. But as Sutton sort of looked deeper, he sort of came on to wanted to look into the Order of Skull and Bones. He wanted to look into to what he called America's secret establishment. And he contacted Charlotte and said, and it just happened to be that these address books had just come in the mail. And her father at that point was getting on in years, right? It was, towards the end of his life, needed to be taken care of quite a bit. And she said that he would be sitting in the other room when she was talking with Sutton about some of this stuff. And he said, she said that he would say things like, Charlotte, I really think you're a good writer, but I don't know if I like the things you write about. And so, there was this, that was about as much as he would articulate. And the way she described it was that, it wasn't really talked about. Right. I mean, they knew, right? Because he had the grandfather clock, which, I took a picture in front of it. That's one of the things. I'm not one of these people that, big on pictures and cameras, but man, do I wish I would have took more pictures of just me and her and things like that. But I do have a picture
Sure.
of the clock. And so, it was just one of these things that it wasn't really spoken of, but there'd be people that would come over like, oh, he's really big in in literary studies, Matheson, F.O. Matheson. A lot of times people call him Mathiasen. And then Spofford, William Spofford, I think was his first name, and I'm pretty sure he was high up in the CFR. And, so these people would come over, and she knew that they were from his Yale fraternity. But, as far as like, anything as far as, the rituals or anything like that wasn't talked about. So there wasn't a lot known. And certainly in terms of like, how they as a network sort of operated in terms of like foreign policy, their funding of Nazis and things like that. No, this stuff wasn't on her radar at the time. It was really Sutton that brought a lot of that to her attention. So she gives the address books, and he's looking through them, and he basically, what he finds is that a lot of the people that popped up in his study of as Western technology and Soviet economic development, a lot of the people that had basically provided the funds and the technology to the Soviet Union were people that were in the Order of Skull and Bones. And then lo and behold, he also discovered that a lot of those people were also involved in the funding of the Nazis, right? And so not only are we funding our enemies in the Soviet Union, we're funding our enemies in Nazi Germany, and which right at the peak of the war, those two were enemies. So we're like funding, like, it's not just two sides of a war, it's like three, or maybe you can think of it as four sides. And so
Prescott Bush, Union Banking Corps, the whole of it. Yeah.
Correct. Right. And so a couple others would have been E. Roland Harriman and Knight Woolley, with two other bonesmen involved, and they were funneling to Fritz
Webster Tarpley's book about that was informative.
Yeah, yeah. I think Chaikin co-authored that with him. Yeah, yeah. And so out of that, this was sort of where Sutton sort of started to infer the Hegelian dialectical manipulation of history through the funding of wars and conflicts, right? And so out of these conflicts, you could bring about a more unified world order, which we see as the result of World War II, right? Out of this, we get the United Nations. And moving forward, we see how the United Nations fits into this global network of your international banks, so your IMF, Bank of International Settlements, your World Health Organization, and then a host of other NGO roundtable organizations that come out of the Rhodes Society and the Quigley model, your CFR, your RIIA, Club of Rome, Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg Group, right? All those sort of like the private arm of what you consider the corporate, or rather the public or government arm of the UN and all these other agencies. And this, right, was brought about through this sort of dialectical manipulation of this conflict. But one of the things that, another thing that showed this to Sutton was when he looked into the involvement of the Order of Skull and Bones in education. And actually, so before he wrote the book, so the book is here, right? The book here is the introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones, right? But before he compiled this into a book, he had written like shorter pieces. So this is how the order controls education. This is actually the first chapter of this book. But before he compiled it, all of his writings into this book, he published these shorter pieces. And in this first chapter, which he told Charlotte, out of everything, right? If you read this book, he calls it his magnum opus, so meaning it's like his best work. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But out of this book, he said the most important chapter was the first one, which is how the order controls education. This sort of gets to your point about, right, the image of the hacking at the branches versus the roots, right? And what he discovered was that most of the bonesmen that were involved in setting up the compulsory education system in the United States, that they were heavily they were big Hegelians. Okay, so all of it was rooted in a Hegelian collectivist philosophy, and they mixed the Hegelianism with a behavioral psychological methodology. Early on, it would have been known as the stimulus response method of classical conditioning, and then later on, it gets evolved into something called behaviorism, and then later operant conditioning.
Right.
Yeah.
If I could interrupt you real quick, would you just give us your definition, at least for the listeners as well? What is Hegelian dialectic?
Okay, so Hegel basically believed that he was an idealist philosopher, so he believed that history evolved through a dialectic of ideas. Okay, and actually, the term evolution is Hegel's, right? It's not Darwin's. Darwin just gave it a biological materialist spin, right? Marx gives it a materialist economic spin. Darwin gives it a biological spin. And then if you can actually think of Freudian psychology, it really is rooted in the same concept, because you have the dialectic of the id and the superego, and then through that dialectic you have a synthesis, and out comes the ego, right, which is what you project, right? So for Hegel in history, you have a set of dominant ideas known as the thesis, and then you have a set of antithetical ideas, which are often come from the oppressed classes, and that through this conflict, right? This is the dialectic. Dialectic actually really just means debate, right? So in the trivium,
or dialogue, yeah,
and so we think of, right, the second one, logic, is often referred to as dialectic in terms of
right.
Logical debate. But so it's right, it's this clash of these opposing forces, and that through the clash, right, you get a synthesis, and the outliers or the extreme polar opposites, right, sort of fizzle out, and what they hold in common becomes this new iteration, and by that you have an evolution. So with something like the World War II, right, you sort of had this dialectic of basically, at least at one level, you had, right, communism versus fascism, right, and you also had another dialectic involving, right, like just Western democracy, right? And then out of this clash, they wanted to create a synthesis in which you would sort of be able to put all that stuff together into a new global system. And today we might call it stakeholder capitalism, right? So which basically has like a communitarian ethos, which is where you get all this like woke ideology that is enforced with like DEI, right, diversity, equity, inclusion, through ESG scoring, but it intimately involves public-private partnerships, right? So this corporate angle, which is basically what Mussolini is often attributed as saying that fascism is corporatism. It's actually kind of it's an apocryphal quote, right? But it might have been attributed to one of his advisors. But nonetheless, right, colloquially, we often refer to fascism as corporatism. So you have the corporate part of fascism, you have the collective communitarianism of communism, sort of smashed together into this stakeholder capitalism. Just sort of as an illustration of how the Hegelian dialectic sort of evolved from that war. Yeah.
Also known as problem reaction solution in some circles.
Yeah, because right, that would be sort of the manipulative use of it, right? Because for Hegel, in some ways, like the idea is right. It's this metaphysical thing that sort of comes through us, right, and is sort of manifest, sort of super organically, right? But if you understand that mechanism in history, right, then you can create a problem in order to elicit a reaction and then offer, right, this predetermined solution, right? And so
exactly.
Yeah.
Right, and that's their MO, which I think a lot of people, fortunately, now are, catching on to. And I've been aware of this, this synthesis, thesis model for probably a couple decades now. And back 20 years or so ago, it was a very lonely time to be awake on this planet or aware of certain things, so I would say we have a lot of work to do, but it's definitely better than it used to be in terms of it's not as lonely. That brings me to basically this international plot, which is this Prussian import of the 1840s and 50s. And again, back to Hegel, where his belief that the state was God. Would you care to just briefly touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of illustrates both his collectivist philosophy and his idea of how the synthesis sort of is manifest, right? So basically, he said the quote is something like, I think it's in his Philosophy of Right, and the quote is something to the effect of, "The state is God marching on earth." Okay, and so again, for Hegel, he had this like spin on the Christian Trinity. So your dialectic, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis is actually a play on the Trinity, and for him, basically, the idea or big idea, right, or reason with a big R, right? It comes down through, right, little reason, right, little R, little mind, through the human being, and then we express that, and it is manifest in the physical realm through politics, civics, and economics. And so basically the aggregate of those three spheres through human will is basically the state, right? And so the state is basically for him this material manifestation of God, or in other words, right, absolute reason, or the absolute idea, sort of come down through the human being and then projected through the institutions of the this corporate government state. Back then, you wouldn't have quite thought of the whole public-private partnership or the stakeholder capitalism the same way, but nonetheless, right, it's the galvanization of all your means of production and your means of governance through institutions, right? And for him, that was the manifestation of God. And this also parallels another concept that he had, which involved the slave master dialectic, right? And for him, it was sort of like this mutually beneficial relationship, so to speak, right? And so that the slave helps the master to, run the state, and the master, takes care of the slave who otherwise wouldn't be able to do it him or herself, right? And so, again, in this paradigm of, this collectivist paradigm of God manifesting itself as the state, built into that or baked into that is a hierarchy of, essentially, right, masters and slaves as well.
That's well said. And how much British influence would you say, like, the Order of Skull and Bones has, as well as other secret societies, on Skull and Bones? And if so, who are those other secret societies that are in your research?
So the Order of Skull and Bones is traced back to a Germanic secret society. The 322 is right. That's the little magic number that they put on everything. And there's different interpretations, but Sutton, the way that he breaks it down is that it basically represents the second period, okay, or the second chapter. So the first would have been traced back to Germany, and Sutton does a thing where if you look at, now this is an interesting little side note here, which is that he's got in here, this is the actual introduction. So I don't know if you can see that, but you'll see, there it goes. Now right. This is up in the corner. If I get my fingers out of there, there's a P up in the, I guess, I don't know, is that left or right on you? I think my camera's mirrored, but there's a P and a D. Okay. And so one is the period and the other one is the decade. Now you'll notice that the font there is different from the font here in the catalogs. So those aren't from, here's the font in the address books. And I could show you the comparable facsimile in here as well.
Mm-hmm.
I won't digress too much. So Sutton, now he had gone to Yale and got some other documents from what's called the Russell Trust Association, their archive. So Russell Trust Association is the corporate name for the incorporated name for the fraternity that is known as the Order of Death, or the Brotherhood of Death. In other words, the Order of Skull and Bones. So it appears that he got those other rosters out of Yale. But if you look at those rosters, there's a P and a D, and if you trace them back far enough, you're about 30-ish years from the abolition of the Bavarian Illuminati. And so Sutton surmises that perhaps the first chapter of the German Order of Skull and Bones was that of the Bavarian Illuminati. It would have only been, a couple decades tops before the Order of Skull and Bones was formulated in the United States. And there's a heavy Germanic influence just in terms of not just the Hegelian philosophy, which undergirds their whole agenda, but also when they went back and gathered up the stimulus response method from Wilhelm Wundt, who, by the way, Wilhelm Wundt, I believe it was his grandfather, Karl Casimir Wundt, was, in fact, a member of the Bavarian Illuminati. And then Johann Gottlieb Fichte, he was not in the order of the Illuminati, but he was around a lot of the people that were. And it's actually him that he conceptualizes the dialectic. Doesn't call it that, but that's where Hegel actually, he borrows it from there and he sort of popularizes it and systematizes it. So I would say that there's, at least in the Order of Skull and Bones, it's a heavy Germanic influence. As far as the British influence, there's sort of a corollary or a parallel in the Rhodes Society. So what we basically have is three. So we have basically a Germanic secret society out of a academic institution, because Adam Weishaupt, I believe, was Ingolstadt University, right? And then we have the British version, which Cecil Rhodes set up through the Rhodes Society, which out of that you get all the roundtable organizations that I mentioned that basically are engines of global governance today. And then you have the American version at Yale. And there's others at Yale as well, by the way. So there's like Scroll and Key, there's Book and Snake. There's others that escape me right now. And there's probably similar societies at Harvard and the other Ivy League schools as well. Interesting little side note was, people have speculated that Ron DeSantis, because he was at Yale, that he was in DKE, Delta Kappa Epsilon. I call it DEEK something.
Right.
And I've not been able to find any primary sources on that. But the funny story is, one time me and Charlotte are sitting in the back room, we're watching the news or something. There's this plaque on the wall, and it's a diamond, and in it there's a DKE. And I'm looking at it, I go, I said, what's that thing? She goes, oh, that's DEEK, some horrible thing my father was a part of. And she goes, I should probably take it off the wall. And then a few days later, she took it off the wall. But there tends to be an overlap between DKE and Skull and Bones. So it's just another example that these sort of these fraternal academic secret societies are feeders that feed people, the elite, into sort of these public institutions that become these roundtables. So the British would have been fed into early on what was known as Milner's roundtables, but after World War I, it would have been the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and then the Americans would have been fed into the Council on Foreign Relations, which is just the British or the American counterpart of that. And then you had something like the Bilderberg Group later. And also, the World Economic Forum, which was set up by Klaus Schwab, there was a heavy influence of Germanic influence in particular, Dutch as well, right? So the Bilderberg Group was set up by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who was himself a Nazi SS. So we're back, right? We're back to this sort of where we were with the Order funding both sides of the war.
Right.
So that's sort of how I would map out these three pillars, right? This Germanic, British, and then this American sort of feeders from the secret societies into these roundtables.
Sure. And then you have your most recent couple generations of royals that actually migrated from Germany and took over the British crown. They seem to operate in the background and put their pieces on the board as they see fit. So, go
ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I love the 4th of July, basically in the sense that freedom to me is not something I celebrate one day of the year, but every day of the year. But the very fact that, I look at the 4th of July and the whole Declaration of Independence and such to be a demarcation line where, even though it was Freemasons and they were part of a much larger order, which is worldwide, they still don't always agree with, the main founders or whatnot. And there's often infighting. And this group of Masons decided to tell their cousin in England to basically, beat off, go to hell. We're going to declare our rights, which is the first time that ever happened, which also makes the U.S. Constitution a direct target. And that's why I thought to myself, perhaps Britain had something, further. I've heard other people say that, they never surrendered. I mean, you can make treaties all you want, but if you don't surrender, but the way that they, chose to get back at America for its blasphemy, including the Pope, who actually, somewhere I read, I can't cite the source because I'm not able to find it any longer, but it was available on the internet. I'm finding that some things that I knew and found out back in the early 2000s are no longer available on the net, as if it's being scrubbed. But one was that the Pope of that time declared the Declaration of Independence to be a satanic document and ordered his Jesuit army to create eternal war with America until it was destroyed, because no man has the right to usurp the Pope's vicarship, who is the grantor, the stand-in for Jesus until his return. So all rights must come from the Pope. But that, together with the British, what they said was the Marcusan model, the long march through the institutions. You take and you wrap all these things together, and they don't have to declare open war against an American United States. What they did instead was infiltrated the institutions And that in particular being education, which is why I say that's the root. And we'll roll that graphic at some point. But this is why it's so important in works like yours and Iserbyt's is to bring this front and center. But if you just want to comment about any of that, I mean, it's basically this U.S. Constitution, as both you and Iserbyt were keen to bring up in your own work. It seems like this Universal Declaration, which nullified both monarchical and papal control of this new nation, were the primary impetus for these subversive tactics going forward.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that to your point, kind of, if we look to the work of Carol Quigley, who wrote Tragedy and Hope here, I actually have an original copy that I got from Charlotte, and I got a letter that in there that from Quigley
Oh,
to
wow.
somebody else.
It's a good book.
Yeah, it's very cool. And but one of the things that he laid out, and he basically was sort of the historian for a lot of these roundtable organizations, and he says as much, right? And he's actually an apologist for them. He just felt that what they should be doing should be brought more out into the open, right? But he was essentially, right, totally in support of sort of this, what he called the Anglo-American establishment. And it's after World War I that we sort of get the beginning of the merger of the British Empire with what would become basically the American Empire. And so after World War I, the same people that set up the CFR and the RIAA were the same people that were involved in the Paris peace treaties. And so you had people like, I believe, Lionel Curtis, Robert Cecil, and another one that escapes me on the tip of my tongue. But those are just a couple of the people that would have been involved in Milner's roundtables and also in the Rhodes Trust. And so at this point, basically, what you get is, sort of to your point, is not a British invasion of the United States, but sort of a partnership in creating the new global order, right? And then, of course, that would sort of manifest itself even further in World War II. And then after that, we get more unification of not just the British Empire with the American Empire, but basically I guess a Euro-American as opposed to just an Anglo-American establishment, and that is the Bilderberg group. Basically, sort of, it's a heavy influence of all walks of European representation there.
Facilitators,
yeah. And so it's not too long after that, a couple decades or whatever, that we eventually get the European Union. But right, the plans for that sort of were cooked up beforehand, and were sort of the details were worked out often at these Bilderberg.
Kalergi and his group,
yeah. And I recently wrote helped out with a book. I usually have it back here, but a friend of mine's borrowing it. It's by Michael Rechtenwald. It's called The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty. Really good book on the Great Reset. And one of the things that I helped out with on the research was we sort of did this, broke down the history of the World Economic Forum, which, right, is the main driver, spokes institution for the Great Reset. Okay. And so the history that we sort of trace it back through its roundtable sort of lineage, back through the Club of Rome, the Bilderberg group, the RIA, CFR, and the roundtables. And then one of the things that I helped put together in there is a chart. It's about 67 members, overlapping memberships between the World Economic Forum and then one or more of all those other roundtables, including, right, so the ones I mentioned, CFR, RIAA, Club of Rome, Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg group. And often what you also found was that not only were they concurrent members of the WEF and one of those other roundtables, but they were also concurrent members of either a branch of the United Nations, whether it's UNESCO or the UNDP or the UNFPA, or the IMF, right? So some of the global banks, the IMF or the World Bank, also the World Health Organization. And then, of course, they are oftentimes also invested in, or CEOs of large companies or foundations, international foundations. But one of the things to sort of illustrate, to re-emphasize sort of the British roots of all of it, was that it just happened to be that the largest preponderance of dual memberships was World Economic Forum and Rhodes Scholars by far. And I can't remember exactly how many Rhodes Scholars were also WEF, but it was many more than were CFR or Bilderberg or something else. And so it highlights, right, how it doesn't just illustrate how all these roundtable organizations are structured similarly and have similar agendas and have overlapping memberships, but that they all are rooted in that early Rhodes Society model. And then what you also notice is that one of the when they announced the Great Reset, one of the main figureheads that was there announcing it was King Charles. Well, he was Prince Charles at the time. Now he's King Charles. And there was even at one of the World Economic Forum sessions, they had, this was before his coronation, but it was like their little unofficial coronation where they had this big crown behind him, and the crown was all colored. It was a digital crown on a screen, and each of the spokes of the crown represented another color, one of the colors of the SDGs, right? And he came up with this Terra Carta. So instead of a Magna Carta, a Terra Carta, and it's all about the rights of the earth, which have to be enforced by the World Economic Forum, and of course him sitting up there high up there at the World Economic Forum. When he comes out to give his speech, Klaus Schwab is like, "Your Royal Highness," and it's very, it's very, there's much deference paid to his royalty. So it's just another example of sort of the strong British roots and influence in the Great Reset and just this whole network of global governance institutions.
It's really interesting to me how it's kind of switched from the imperialist conquest to a mental conquest. I guess they started to realize, that they couldn't militarily take over every nation on earth, but if you were to invite the leaders of every nation into more or less a thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis kind of Bilderberg or, League of Nations in the beginning, which failed, and then the United Nations. But ultimately, this synthesis is these organizations that are then the ones to dictate. But they also dictate policy going forward, but they also realize that people are unwilling to change in most parts. So they also employ these models that are basically, as Machiavelli would say, using fear, which is a one-way street. You don't have to worry about reciprocation, which is what love is, a giving for regiving. So interestingly enough, that's the model that they adopt. They constantly are, releasing headlines based on fear, and a lot of this is black pill, folks. But the good thing is we're gonna give you a black pill today, then a red and a blue, and finally a white pill at the end of this broadcast. So get your notes out. John Klyczek and Iserbyt's work is extremely well done in terms of just if you just go and you take a look at the notes and the end notes, footnotes, references, I mean, it's almost as much as is the written part of the book in both of their works. And so it's really well done. And we've really covered in the opening of this for the first hour a great history. And now we're going to move toward education itself. But speaking of my first question, which I meant to ask you early on, but I think it comes in really well right now. And it's so great to see. Myself, I didn't go to college. I never went to university, but I ended up becoming president of a university, interestingly enough. And that's formerly the Walter Russell Foundation, not to be mistaken of any acquaintance with the Russell Trust, two different family lines. As far as I'm concerned, they don't have any relation in between them other than maybe multiple removed generations. But nonetheless, Walter Russell was a self-taught autodidact artist who mastered all the 5 fine arts. He was a living, walking example of the trivium and quadrivium that moved in the mind of one man, and also his beloved Leo Russell, whose work has really influenced me. That's the university that I was president of. But one of the things that interests me is so often in academia, we don't see somebody come from academia who is able to turn the mirror back on academia, such as yourself or such as Charlotte did. And I think that is such a needed thing, because it's not like somebody who's on the outside holding a mirror to academia, because academia really doesn't have to pay attention to them. They can just say, oh, they're a nutter. We don't have to listen to what they say because they aren't credentialed anyways. But the fact that you went through it, and in your book, in the intro, you have, prime recognition for a lot of your professors and such. So tell me from your personal, and it's so good to see again that, and I think that carries a hell of a lot of weight when a person can come from academia and then hold a magnifying glass to it and really critique it, give it a very great critiquing, such as yourself and Charlotte did. Have you, in your critiquing of the institution, and just more or less, how is it, and should we promote your school that allowed you to do this, more or less? And then how is it that you were able to turn it around and face it back at academia itself without getting blacklisted? Or have you encountered any resistance in your critiquing of the academic education of today?
Yeah, I had sort of a circuitous path through all things educational and academic. So, I mean, when I was in, K through 12, prior to college, but didn't take things very seriously at all. I was one of these kids that, I guess everybody said I was pretty sharp or whatever, but I just used whatever sharpness I had to figure out how to cut enough corners to get the minimum grade I needed so that I could have fun on the weekends,
Mhm.
And so, I was just like always looking at like, how many points is this worth? Well, I can skip that and I can do this. And then, how can I get the minimum number of points here? Try to find a, shortcut. And so I actually didn't read very much anything that was assigned to me. The only time I remember actually reading something that was assigned was when I was suspended one time, and I didn't have anything else to do. So I got home, and they send the suspension letter in the mail. Well, if you get there before, if Dad doesn't get home before the mail gets there, I would grab it, hide it, and then I'd go to the bus stop and pretend like I was going to, school. And then when the bus would come, I'd just go to the park. And, you can't be out. You'll get in trouble if the police see you out when you're supposed to be in school. They'll at least try to grab you for truancy and then take you home, and then Dad will find out. So I would go to the park, and I took a book, and it was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was the only thing that I actually read significantly. In any way that wasn't just skim it enough so I could fill out the worksheet or whatever. But I did read a lot of. I was really interested in just religion, just ultimate reality, metaphysics, right? I didn't read any of the classical philosophers, the Greeks, the pre-Socratics, or Plato, Aristotle, or anybody that followed. But I did read the Four Noble Truths, and I was really into the I Ching. I read the whole Old Testament, so that was kind of my, I guess I was sort of an autodidact. When I got to college, I sort of just illustrated that, I wasn't exactly the most well-behaved or disciplined young person. I mean, even the little bit of martial arts I did at the time was not in a disciplined fashion, meaning my conditioning didn't take care of it. I'd work on technique until I ran out of breath very quickly, and then, maybe come back to it the next day. But when I got to college, I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I got to take it seriously. So at that point, I was a very good student in the sense that my whole goal was what do you want me to do, and how do I meet your expectations, right? And a lot of that involves just sort of regurgitating the lecture, right? If you can regurgitate the lecture in a paper, especially in, because I was literary studies, early on, it was actually, I was going to teach high school. And then there was that became a lot of red tape. And so instead they told me at the college, because I was very good at, just sort of repeating what the theory and the way that affirmed their understanding of it. And I could do it. I could use the jargon very well, right? And my writing is, at least my prose it's dense, but it's grammatically clean and things like that. So they were like, well, we'll have you back. Like, we'll pay for your master's. And it's probably good that I didn't get, I guess, red pilled or, sort of start to push back or go outside of their paradigm until I got the master's, because they probably wouldn't have paid for the master's if I had started expressing some of the other ideas. And what had happened was, I wasn't really into like geopolitics and stuff like that, but I was always really into history, and certainly in the history of ideas, history of, religious ideas and philosophical ideas. But then I slowly started to kind of get into like geopolitics around like the Bush era. And, you can't get through academia without getting some form of Marxist indoctrination, right? And it's even in literary studies, right? So when you read literature, there's all these different lenses or theories that you apply when you read the text in modern literary studies, right? Back in the day, there was basically philology, then there was the historical approach, then there was the biographical approach, and then eventually they came up with the close reading approach, which is basically what does the text say, and then how can you interpret the language based on, right, the historical context, right? But working more closely with the trivium in the sense of, right, interpreting the words in the context with the meanings, the diction that they have, as opposed to when you get into some of the postmodern stuff, right, you start to apply Freudian analysis or Marxist analysis or feminist analysis or queer theory. And so it doesn't matter what the author intended. It doesn't matter the context of the time. It doesn't matter what the words mean in terms of diction, because you're going to filter that through the presuppositions of these other lenses, right, whether they be Freudian, Marxist, etc. And so at some point, right, I remember the first time I saw Marxist theory and was like, why do they get this? Like, I didn't know a whole lot about it. Like, why would I want to read this dictator guy's lens? Like, this doesn't make sense. And then they give you this whole thing about class dialectics. And it's like, okay, I can see that. I'm a working class guy, right? Like, I can sort of see that. And then you look around and you see like Bush, and he's doing these wars. And, I was always skeptical of 9/11, even before I knew enough about the details of what had gone down to actually have a theory. But I just remember, as a kid going like, we started off, it was Osama bin Laden got us. And so we need to, he's this Afghani guy. We need to go to Afghanistan. And then they're like, oh yeah, but no, he's in Saudi Arabia. Oh no, he's not in Saudi Arabia. He's over in Iraq. Oh, he's not in Iraq, but they got terrorists over there. Oh no, there's not terrorists over there, but there's weapons of mass destruction. Oh, there's not weapons of mass destruction, but he's a bad guy and we need to free him. And I remember that. I remember changing the narrative. I'm like, there's no way they're lying about something.
Right.
It's got to be one or the other. It certainly can't be all four, right? And so, but you look around at the time, or at least the space that I was in, you see Bush, and he's like a capitalist, right? So now the Marxist stuff kind of starts to like, okay, yeah, this is against what Bush and these guys are doing. So yeah, I'm like for this, right? Like, and then Obama gets in and does the same thing, and all the people that were like the socialists and the Marxists, when I would start to point out that he's doing the same thing, they were like, they would do these mental gymnastics to explain why it's okay when he does it. And I'm like, what is going on? Like, this is like at the end of the day, I'm a principled person, right? If there's a contradiction, I'm not gonna just, go with my cognitive dissonance and assert what I want to believe, right? I'm gonna have to figure out, I'm gonna have to undo the contradiction, or I'm gonna have to undo what I thought about the situation before I saw the contradiction, right? And so at this point, I start looking at more like libertarian kind of stuff. I had some friends sending me, conspiracy theory stuff. And I would go like, this can't be true. Like, one of the first things, this sort of illustrates, the prism of academia, which is that I always say this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but it wasn't until my senior year of undergrad that I even knew what eugenics was. Now, when you go through academia, right, and literary studies in particular, everything is always filtered through either race, class, gender, sexuality. Race, class, gender, sexuality. So the first one, race, right? What we all see today is anti-racism and critical theory. That I experienced or dialogue with people from that paradigm all throughout academia. Now, it wasn't quite as like cultish where like you have to affirm it and agree with it. It was just like these were different theories that you studied, and people had different ideas, and and there's a lot of truth to a lot of the at least I was really into African American studies and just the history of the plight of Black people in America, and so there's a core in there that is true, but to the extent that they would emphasize that, I mean, would you never heard eugenics? Right. So, I mean, like, I didn't understand how we could talk about like, antebellum slavery and Jim Crow and, they didn't use the term microaggressions yet, but right. They would call it, I think it was critical whiteness studies. Like, who was the guy? I think Tim Wise. They were really big on Tim Wise and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But they never talk about eugenics. And then come to find out, people like the Fabians, right, were these, these lefties, right, these socialists who were really part of the, the British intelligentsia and were, basically the intellectual aristocracy, not the nobility, but right, they were of that milieu. They were all into eugenics, and these people are always,
your Sangers and such. Yeah.
Stopes, Marie Stopes, and all that. Yeah, mm-hmm. Russell. Who's the Bertrand Russell? That is,
of course, yeah.
George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, the Huxleys, right? All these people.
Yeah.
And in social, in these socialist, Marxists, whatever you want to call this group of people in academia that tout that line, they're all about the Darwinism, right? Well, it's Darwin was basically the precursor for eugenics, right? It was his cousin Galton that basically thought that you could harness natural selection through selective breeding, right? Through positive and negative eugenics, which just means in the positive part is the elite inbreeding, and the negative part is sterilization, euthanasia, abortion, anything to cull the so-called unfit. And so it was like another moment where it was like, well, how did I get all the way through this and nobody taught me this? So the first time I heard about eugenics was like, I think it was actually a friend sent me, it was an Alex Jones documentary. It was Endgame. And I was like, come on, this is wacky, and you look at it, like, oh, wow. And like, I would go and like you're saying that there was this eugenics thing that Hitler, that was part of his, race science. And you're saying that we funded it. And so I would go and look up RockefellerFoundation.org, go to the annual reports, and there it is. They funded the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics.
Sure enough.
I would go down to the library, and you could find old Human Betterment Foundation documents that would have tables of all the people they sterilized in California. And it was like this moment where it was like, okay, so I've been lied to. And that was part of why I actually was, what sort of got me into the whole Marxism thing for a moment there, was that it was another moment where it was like when I learned about the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And, when you heard about them in, grade school, it was like the Black KKK. And it was like, no, Fred Hampton was organizing with what they called the Young Patriots that were white people. He was organizing with the Young Lords who were Latino. And so, it was this very much this working class, in many ways organic thing. And it was like, and I'm from Chicago, so I had, I sort of affinities for this area and the movements there. And but it was just these two things that sort of came together. And then by that time, I wanted to, I had pitched sort of like an independent study to write about Brave New World and to sort of explicate. I wanted to bring an academic approach to some of the conspiracy theories about our funding of Nazis and eugenics, and how that is baked into the paradigm that Huxley is writing about in Brave New World, and how, if you look at his nonfiction essay, which I have, and I think I'm going to be presenting a paper on this in Poland actually in September. That Huxley was entirely for eugenics. He was for a scientific aristocracy, what he called the scientific caste system, what he called an intellectual aristocracy. He warned about overpopulation all the way up until he basically died. So in his Brave New World Revisited, he emphasizes it. So all the stuff that's in there, the Malthusianism, the eugenics, the behavioral conditioning, all of it, he was all for it, right? Like, if you read his writings, his rhetoric is kind of Rogerian, where it's like he kind of starts like he looks at both sides and he weighs the pros and cons, and by the time you get to the end of the paper, it's almost it's not like he's explicitly asserting that we have to go with, for one example, the eugenics or the Malthusianism or the conditioning, but it's like it's kind of inevitable and it's probably going to have some bad stuff, but it'll be worse if we don't. And that's sort of the tenor of all of his arguments. It's never like a repudiation of biological engineering or population control or any of these things. And so the instructor basically told me that the quote was, "I don't want to spend a whole semester talking about how H.G. Wells is trying to take over the world." Well, that's not what I was saying at all, right? So it was like, and I liked her. She's a nice lady, nice professor. And she did help me get some scholarships. And I should note, some of the professors in there, a lot of them, there's a couple of them that I still keep in touch with, but a lot of them, by that point, when I would walk down the hall, people who, when I started, talking more libertarian and like bringing some of this alternative history up, people that when they would see me in the hallway, they'd be like, "Oh, John, how you doing?" They'd walk by and be like, they'd act like, it's just me and you in a hallway. I know you see me, and I would be like, and they just wouldn't even talk to me. Like, so,
Wow.
but I still said, and I still thank them for, for the things that they did help me with, right? So because they did help me get some scholarships and they did promote me. And, I did learn at least, I learned their discourse, right? I learned their lexicon, right? I learned how to operate in there. I learned their methods of citation and a certain academic rigor. So I still use all of that, and I just apply it to, sort of critiquing the paradigm that they sort of are in. But I still, I always credit where credit's due. I can't denounce everything about it. But yeah, so at that point, I became an adjunct, and I don't know if y'all know what that means, but it basically means I'm hired per course, per semester, no tenure track, no office, no benefits. So in many ways,
No front row parking spot.
none of that, right? And here's the benefit of it, though, is that, because you asked, like, have I been blacklisted or anything like that? They don't pay any attention to me. As long, I'm just sort of like, I'm like the janitor or like,
The ghost and the machine.
yeah, any random staff worker, and like,
Right.
As long as the students are happy and as long as they don't complain, they don't bother me. And I went out of my way to, there's a few people I work with that I gave books to, right around the lockdowns, and there was no response either way. There wasn't like, "Oh wow, this is really interesting." It wasn't like, "You're crazy." It was just no response at all. The closest I think I might have got to being kind of like outed was like during when they released the CARES money,
Mm-hmm.
and I wiggled my way into being the adjunct representative because we had to decide how to spend the money, and there's 3 categories: PPE, distance learning, technologies, and there's a third one that I can't remember off the top of my head. But my main thing that I focused on in my little task force or whatever was education technologies to facilitate the distance learning. And long story short was everybody would propose things, and they would propose these vague, like, "Oh, we need for dental tech, we need a simulator." And it didn't say which simulator from which company, or, and I would so they propose it. And I was like the only person. I tried to be as diplomatic as possible. So instead of saying no, I would be like, "Need more information." And we get to the meeting and I'd ask him, like, "What simulator are you talking about? What company does it come from? What's the data policy? What's the privacy policy? What's the data on how, the efficacy? Does it actually do what it purports to do?" And, pretty much everybody else rubber stamped it. And then my needs more information basically just got, pushed to the wayside. At a certain point, I tried to illustrate how all this stuff was sort of comes together in a broader system. And I think if we get a chance to watch that video, I played them part of that, and the response was that there's no such thing as privacy anymore. But that was 2 years ago, and haven't bothered me since. So I will say one interesting thing is that I got which is something I never thought would happen. Once I thought I wrote the book, I thought I was just waiting for right, like you said, for someone to be like, hey,
right?
Yeah. But there's a the oldest university in Poland invited me to a paper, a call for papers, and to present a paper there. So, I mean, what's funny is I probably would have never been offered to speak at such a prestigious university had I just regurgitated, all the stuff that comes down from the department and whatever foundation funds us. So,
right. So really what you did was you distinguished yourself, much like Charlotte did, and that's what I mean by the academia turns out, the Marxist ants that are all marching in unison. There's nothing to distinguish any greatness between them. And I think that's what, the impetus for the great meme of the NPC represents, those who are conditioned to only think by repeating and remembering. The B.F. Skinner model, Rousseau, Wundt, Dewey, Maslow, Rogers, onward. And this is where, again, Charlotte's work is like this whole thing 1.0, where yours is sort of a 2.0, where you really tackle the technological aspects of this. So when you saw this 2020 unfold in this, Corona 1984, as I like to call it, but was that your first introduction into this real technological overthrow, would you say? And was that what spurred you, or was your book already released at that time and you had already gone through this view of the technological aspect?
Yeah. So I wrote the book so the first article, which became the first chapter, I think was 2015 or 2016.
Okay. So you started quite ahead of that curve then.
Yeah.
Actually seeing it implemented,
Yeah. And what's funny is early on, the book was listed on Amazon to have 90 pages because I thought that a lot of the stuff, a lot of the sort of futuristic sci-fi sounding technologies, I thought that was all theoretical and maybe prototypical, and that, there would just be a short section that would sort of cover things to come. And as I get into it, it's like, whoa, like just as one example, like the brain-computer interfaces that Neuralink that Musk is working on, and Facebook's got their own versions of, and other big tech companies have different versions of. The first neural implant goes back to the 60s, early 60s, late 50s. Escapes my mind in the particulars, but where they were prototypes in this book here. Physical Control of the Mind by Jose Manuel Rodriguez Delgado, who, by the way, he was a Yaley. He was at Yale when he did this. And there's an article that's on my website. I always forget the title of it. It's something like A Free Market Future of Brain-Computer Interfaces, a neo-fascist history of eugenics or something like that. But it's the one that's on brain-computer interfaces. It was written about 2019, late 2019, because the book got published 2019. And in there I show that he was surrounded by many a bonesman, and actually one of his assistants that helped him put some of the brain computer interfaces in. For those that are sensitive to animal suffering, maybe look away, but I would just like to show this so you can see some examples of.
Sure.
This is him. So this is a monkey with the see, they got they're very crude, like almost like vacuum tube electrodes and stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And so this is, but he's got pictures of they did it to human mental patients as well. And his assistant was Hannibal Hamlin. And Hannibal Hamlin, I'm gonna fact check me. I might be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure it's his son or his grandson who is a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. And there was 3 people. One was Frank Davis Ashburn. I can't remember the other two names. One was set up the Yale Council, which was in charge of like basically the science departments, right? And then another one was the treasurer at the time. And these people were all, and the Yale Council was set up almost in tandem with the arrival of Delgado. So basically what you see is sort of Bonesman sort of involved in the financing and sort of the science, the institutional development of the science departments around sort of the programs that he would have been running. But so I thought that you know, again, that this type of stuff was going to be a really short part of the book. Okay. Mm-hmm. And it turns out, right, that it ended up being a 500-page book. I think 100 of those pages is the citations, right? Right. I had still thought, even though I had seen all that, like the last chapter, maybe 2 chapters, is almost like a literature review of stuff that's right, that they've made a lot of progress on, but is not in the classroom. Right. Most of the book is stuff that's pretty much in the classroom, or at least has been piloted in the classroom. Like in that last section, we might touch on it during this interview here, is sort of the AI tutor bots. Right. And I actually just got an ad for what is effectively a social emotional learning robot called Moxie in YouTube. Did a little video on it. Right. So that's an example of something that just recently have I seen it sort of become like commercially available or popularized in everyday advertising. But I figured that I had at least 10 years to sort of warn everybody about what's coming, right? I would sound a little kooky at first, but as these things sort of get rolled out piece by piece, I'd be talking about them and they go, hey, that's the thing that guy was talking about, you know, and, you know, maybe they would be prepared. They would have a heads up so that they could know, right, what to sort of resist as far as those things go. And then, so it was published October 2019, and what was it, 5 months later, COVID 1984. What's interesting is I was on the Ed Opperman show in January or February that year, and I was talking about how all these technologies are going to be used to data mine these kids, and then they're going to take all that data and they're going to put it into a social credit database. And Ed goes, "How long are we talking about here? How long do we got?" And I said, well, the number that the futurists and the transhumanists put forward is a sort of a range from 2030 to 2045 is going to be somewhere in there is going to be the singularity. Sometimes they say 2030, sometimes they say 2035, 2040, 2045, right? It's roughly in there, right? So I'm thinking at least 10 years, maybe more, okay? But I figure, right, that's when the singularity happens. So a lot of it you'll see sort of, already kind of in place. And I said, but because we were talking Hegelian dialectic and the Order of Skull and Bones and, artificial crisis creation. I said, with the right crisis, a lot of this stuff could be accelerated and we could see it a lot faster. And it wasn't 2 months later that we had the whole COVID lockdowns, and then everybody was forced online. And then so it really made the book take off, I think, in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have, because even, like I call them normie friends, but they certainly don't spend the time that you or I spend sort of looking at this stuff. But they would say, like, man, like, they're at home and all they see is their kids on screens, and he was like, this is like what you're talking about. And so I kind of had a bird's eye view of it before we got to the lockdowns. And then once we got to the lockdowns, I was sort of like, one of the first things I noticed was they sort of deregulated, or they put in some federal regulations. I used to know the number by heart. I think it was 85 FR 18638. Yeah, that should be it. And it's the distance learning, distance learning rules. But if you looked in it, basically it was what it was authorizing was it was green lighting the use of AI to teach. So before that, you had to have a certain number of contact hours between a student and a teacher for it to qualify as you actually taking a class and learning. And basically what's in there, and you can go to my my article to get the precise language. It's one of my CARES Act articles, that they were basically saying that adaptive learning courseware, which is a form of artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence, direct quote, more broadly, that can be used as a substitute for human interaction, right? And so, so I sort of was able to kind of anticipate what they were going to do while they had everybody hostage on these distance learning devices.
Wow, amazing. And yeah, it's it all stems from the Pavlovian, Skinnerian condition, away from trivium, quadrivium, classical learning styles, to this basically. Skinner was a Harvard utopian psychologist, but this conditioning toward workforce training. And basically, when you define learning from the classical period, which ended about the turn of the 20th century, somewhere in there, maybe a decade or two before, but it's drawing out the innate talents and abilities by imparting knowledge of the trivium or quadrivium. Again, one's like a grade school, one's like a high school, as far as that goes, but as channels for expression of those abilities to serve the child. And one of the things that in a stagnating system, especially in academic circles, Neil deGrasse Tyson is my favorite poster child to show what stagnation in academia looks like, especially when he was confronted by I think it was Del Bigtree in an interview that he did, where he said, "I don't care about individual science. That doesn't matter. It means nothing. All I care about is consensus science." So in a way, the Iserbyts and the Klyczeks of the world are these, individuals who dare to go against the machine, the collective. But without that, right, there is no growth, because as Hawking said, philosophy is dead. Science can now answer these what if questions. Who are we? Why are we here? But he's basically hacking the whole tree off from its own root, because philosophy is the very root that caused science to grow in the first place. And it was mavericks who questioned the orthodoxy of the church and went against it, as only metaphysical explanations were allowed that were in line with the Gospels. You couldn't be like a Pico and De La Mirandola and come out with, there's, the Chaldeans, there's the Zoroastrian, there's this, there's that also says much of the same thing. And he syncretized a lot of that through dialectic, which was more or less dialogue or the blending of greater truths into a more even greater truth. But the point of all of this is that it's always the individual who is the maverick that ends up bringing this prophetic foreshadowing of events and their unfoldment and the warnings of it they see further down the road, because they're not bound to a consensus reality. And so in that's what makes academia and academicians able to upgrade their own fields of research. And that's the danger, I think. And where like a Walter Russell or a Victor Schauberger or a Nikola Tesla or others that are able to come in, Alexander Graham Bell or Edison, or, a lot of these folks didn't even graduate high school, but they were able to invent because they weren't locked into a collectivist system of, training you to be some form of a human capital, as opposed to a free thinking individual who is able to constructively criticize the reality around them without criticizing, let's just say, the traditional values or the things that you were introduced to, like this, Marxist view of the world that was basically forced down your throat. So would you care to just expound on that, about how the individual versus the collective and what part of you having to claim that individual, and wrestle it away from the collective allowed you to do the work that you did and continue on with what you're doing today?
Yeah. So I mean, to your point, all of scientific development was always the one person that went against the consensus, right? And not just against the consensus for the sake of going against it, but for the point of showing out that what the consensus has concluded, right, that there's a missing piece, right, or a contradiction, or right, there's a way that it can be expanded or refined. And so I mean, science, it's science, you hear this, trust the science. Well, that's an ethos claim, right? Trust has to do with, right, trusting due to character, credibility, or authority. It has nothing to do with logos. It has nothing to do with logic, right? The science should be based on the data, which should be based on logic or the logos, right? And the logos has no bearing on consensus, right? Or in other words, right, the logos is true regardless of whether the consensus sees and discovers and realizes that it is true. And conversely, right, the consensus cannot invert or undo or invalidate the true logos, the truth, right? What the data should show. So you never trust or believe science, right? You prove science, right? You show the data, right? And the person or the people who purport to be the arbiters or the to quote Fauci, I am the science, right? To be the representative of science, have nothing, right? That have no bearing on the science itself, other than, right, hopefully you can speak or you can quantify things well enough that other people can understand it, right? And so, this whole idea of consensus, I mean, just gets us back to the notion of a collectivist idea of the self, if you can even call it that, once we sort of smash or amalgamate all of the individuals into the collective. If there is an individual self in there separate from the state as God marching on earth, basically you just become a mechanism, right? Like you become just a little small gear in this larger mechanism of, right, government programs and industries, right, different markets. And for Skinner, basically the solution or the purpose of education is to sort of engineer the individual gears through stimulus response mechanisms in the environment in a way that you will turn your little gear will turn seamlessly and harmoniously with the bigger gears of, right, corporations and governance that make up the state, right? For Skinner, right, basically all consciousness, all behavior is nothing more than a reflex, a reaction or a response, like neurologically, to environmental stimuli. So you can't say that somebody is wrong or unethical or immoral, or that, right, that the problem or the solution lies somewhere in that person heightening or raising their consciousness or refining their consciousness in a way that connects to the logos, so that they have an objective relationship to objective truth and the external world. It's just, instead of, he just sort of inverts it and says that, well, if you set up the society in ways, right, with enough government and corporate programs to where there's enough environmental stimuli, enough incentives, enough punishments and rewards in the broader state as God, if you put that together appropriately, that the so-called individual, right, that gear will then turn, right? And so when it's not turning, it's just because it's not because there's something wrong with the consciousness, or where the person needs to enlighten themselves through the trivium, etc. It's just that the environment needs to be reconfigured. And it's sort of expressed, and he's got a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, right? Because for him, right, freedom and dignity implies volition. It implies that, right, the self that you understand yourself to be, right, the inner monologue that you hear inside your head when you're thinking through problems, when you're questioning the data, right, when you're applying your grammar, logic, and rhetoric to decipher the objective truth, that's all ephemeral, right? That's an illusion. It's like sort of the superstition, right? And if that's not there, then there is no freedom. Again, you're just a mechanism, right? And if you're just a mechanism, there is no dignity. That's another illusion, right? It's either the mechanism is wound properly or it's not, right? And so what this does is reduces all forms of individual volition or consciousness basically to the function of state social engineering, right? And so there's
Would that also be called systemized operant conditioning?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of social credit, it's a giant Skinner box, right? So basically, what you do is you're going to intermediate every facet of life: healthcare, workforce, education, housing, transportation, right? You're gonna intermediate that through some digital device or some digital platform, whether through a blockchain ID, a digital ID, or through through like what some of the new agers call the hollow movement. So having like different holographic interfaces that you could use through Google Glass or maybe an implantable or a wearable, and that, right, in order for you to access, right, to go to the grocery store, right, to get your reward, right, you have to conform to whether it be, you have to put in enough work hours to get your social credit score up, or, right, you have to demonstrate that you're a obedient citizen in the sense that, right, your diversity, your equity score is up, right? So you have to tout the right politically correct identitarian politics online, right, in your social discourse, right? Both of these two metrics kind of coming together, and that's going to determine whether or not you get to go in and get the reward of food. And if you don't, then the punishment is going to be that, right, you can't go in there. And so, right, you're going to be constantly pushed around by these punishments and rewards from the state, intermediated through these technologies that are manufactured by these companies through these public-private partnerships. And those punishments and rewards are going to basically run your life, right? They're going to direct you to where you go. And whether or not you have any opposition to it, right, if you have any argument against it, right, for him and for the behaviorist, it's all ephemeral, right? Like there is no ethical basis for you to object to that if it has the outcome that they need. In other words, right, whatever your conscience might say, that's an illusion. The outcome is that, right, we're getting you to behave in harmony with the broader global planned economy, right, through all the different institutions that we've mentioned, right? And for you to even suggest anything to the contrary, we would have to acknowledge that you have a conscience, that you have a consciousness, that there is a mind, that there is objective truth, that there is a logos, right, that there is reality. And for them, that's all. Like Yuval Noah Harari basically says that his analogy is that the consciousness is basically, his analogy is, it's like the roar that an engine makes when it's flying through the air, right? It has no function in terms of propelling the airplane through the sky. It's a side effect, right? Like it's just the noise that it makes after all of the aerodynamics, right? All of the
Right, and never mind that it was the idea in the head of the man who invented it that made it fly. It's as if they're taking consciousness itself and systematically reducing it to a invalid state of stimuli response through mechanism.
Yeah.
And that's what we could go on for literally probably 6 to 8 hours in this interview, but I really want to move us to a particular toward the ending, which is again the white pill. But we got about 20 minutes left to the 2-hour mark, and I don't mind to go a little over, but I want to be respectful of your time as well. So basically, these methods and how they tie across the public-private sector, charter schools, technical colleges, are based around this mighty computer and data world, which is more or less letting the devil in through the back door, so to speak. And the primary target in all of this is, of course, the child. And, we're going to talk later about how to protect children, what those best practices are. And even that term best practices is probably something that doesn't necessarily involve consciousness as much as it should. But more or less, we're seeing this populi reduction down to an animal-based level of, reward. Here's the chocolate. What is it? The lifeboat exercise from the 60s was moving us along toward that, where, the kids actually thought of ways to save everybody, but that wasn't a passing grade. You have to figure out a different way, but still allow for people to die. So they're basically removing consciousness with a dictated outcome. So I know you had written, I asked for you to send some points over. We'll try to get to them too, but real quick, what are your thoughts on these methods and how they tie across in the public, private sector, charter schools, technical colleges? Because a lot of people are under, and this is sad to me in one opinion, that you can't look at this as something like, well, I'll let my kid go to public school, but I'll fix him later after he gets out, because it doesn't work that way. You got to be vigilant and be involved with especially your child's education, because this is the root of their personality and how they're going to grow up. So how are these methods, these AI methods and such, reaching into, because a lot of people are like, well, if I just put my kid in a private school, he'll be raised fine. But a lot of these private schools are implementing this AI stuff as much as the public schools are. So let's talk about that a little bit. How do the public, private sector, charter schools, technical colleges, universities, et cetera, all use this similar technology? And what, if any, like the Steiners or the Montessori schools, are the ones for kids and parents to go to that will save them from exposure to this kind of thing?
Yeah, so I could basically lay out the whole technological infrastructure in several iterations. And the first one, anybody that's ever had to do any distance learning would be familiar with, would be what's called the LMS, or the Learning Management System. And oftentimes, even if you're not online, a lot of the instructors like to put a bunch of the assignments on the LMS, which I never like to do. But after lockdowns, now you have to have them on there. And then the funny thing is now, you used to have like a rain day or a snow day. They don't have those anymore, because they make the instructor put the entire course on the LMS. So even if you want to do everything paper and pen in the classroom, there's a day, like, because it's, the weather is inclement or whatever, or power blackout, whatever, for whatever reason, you can't go into the actual classroom. Well, we're going to have class online that day. So, obviously that helps, because they get money based on attendance, right? Who's in the building on a given day. So that helps with their cash flow, obviously. But basically what it illustrates is that even the face-to-face classrooms are slowly being interfaced with a range of technologies that are almost all of them platformed through this LMS. And it's just a dashboard. There's like Blackboard, Desire to Learn. What's another one? Canvas. Okay, those are some of the three most popular. I've used all three of them. And it's just a dashboard where you can make modules, put assignments on there. But what you can also load them with are one of the most immediate, some people might be familiar with, is called adaptive learning courseware. And adaptive learning courseware is just the digital version of the teaching machines that B.F. Skinner developed. So if you can go on the Smithsonian Institute website and you can type in teaching machines, and you'll see some of the old analog versions. This was before they were electronic in any way. Basically, gears and wheels kind of remind you of like an old Viewmaster. So it was like a box and had two slots, and they had these round cards with like question and answer, maybe multiple choice matching, something like that. And you put the card in, it's got the learning stimulus, which is the question, right? And then your response, you scribe on the other slot, whether it's again, right, multiple choice matching, whatever, maybe short answer. Then you turn the gear forward, it can only go one way, and you get automated response. So this is where they say it's personalized or individualized, even though, right, we've sort of illustrated that it's not individualized in the sense that the student, right, gets to learn, follow their own individual curiosity, and they guide the curriculum based on their individual curiosity and what they want to learn. It's individualized in the sense that it's like micromanage, meaning that like we can individually target each student to properly conform them as gears in the broader collective system. But if you look at some of the adaptive learning courseware products, so you got like Brightspace Leap, Smart Sparrow, Clever, Newton. Some of these have been funded by Bilderberg, Peter Thiel. And if you look at them, like Dreambox in particular, explicitly traces the technology back to Skinner's analog teaching machines in his book called The Technology of Teaching, which was, by the way, all that work that he did and the book in particular, which is not just theoretical expose of all his operant conditioning, program instruction, teaching machine research, but it also is a showcase of some of the analog versions, but also some of the electronic versions that were piloted by IBM. That was funded by the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education at the time, and that was McGeorge Bundy, who was a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. He was also actually at one point he was the president of the Ford Foundation, and while he was the president of the Ford Foundation, the vice president was another bonesman named Harold Howe III, and Harold Howe III was actually a commissioner of education back in, I want to say, the 60s, or it might have been the late 50s. Okay, but the modern adaptive learning courseware, basically it's taking the stimulus response algorithm. So depending on how quickly or efficiently the student responds to the learning stimuli, it's going to either expedite that student towards like higher learning, right? That's what something like John Taylor Gatto called the propedeutic function of education out of Alexander Inglis's 6 Principles of Education. So it's basically to train like the elite or the managerial class, right? And if the student doesn't do so good, that algorithm, right, they don't respond very quickly or they don't respond very accurately, it's going to remediate the student, okay? And it's going to make the student, retake the course. And in this way, right, the elites can move ahead faster. They don't have to be held back by the rest of the class, and the students that need more work, they don't have to be rushed forward. They can take their time. This is the pitch of how it's individualized. Okay. And this is going to data mine the students' cognitive behavioral algorithms. The interesting thing is that the algorithms that process that operant conditioning stimulus response are explicitly referred to as analogous to the behavioral advertising algorithms that are used to personalize your like on Netflix, whatever movies that thinks you might want to watch. So based on the stuff that you've watched, whether you liked it, how long you watched it, stuff like that, it's going to personally offer you, oh, you like that, it means you like this, right? Those algorithms use essentially the same types of stimulus response data that the EdTech, the adaptive learning courseware uses, okay? And then the next level of that, which is starting to get worked in more, some of them have been piloted. Usually these are piloted for students that have some form of documented learning disability, maybe like test anxiety or something. And so these are going to be biofeedback wearables. So these are going to be everything from like EEG headbands or halos, heart rate monitors, galvanic skin response monitors. Still works on the stimulus response, but instead of an external stimulus and a cognitive response, it's basically going to take an external stimulus and an emotional response, or basically a neurological or physiological affective response, right? So it's going to...
John,
yes, sir.
sorry to interrupt you, but I think this would be a great time to let me roll about 2 minutes of that, how China is using artificial intelligence, because you're hitting it right there. So stand by, guys. Here's a little video that John sent over.
红色是表示你的专注力显示得很高。
Teachers at this primary school in China
蓝色是走神了，
know exactly when someone isn't paying attention.
白色就是你可能跟网络还没有连接好。
These headbands measure each student's level of concentration. The information is then directly sent to the teacher's computer and to parents. China has big plans to become a global leader in artificial intelligence. It has enabled a cashless economy where people make purchases with their faces. A giant network of surveillance cameras with facial recognition helps police monitor citizens. Meanwhile, some schools offer glimpses of what the future of high-tech education in the country might look like.
做出选择吧 Good job!
Classrooms have robots that analyze students' health and engagement levels. Students wear uniforms with chips that track their locations. There are even surveillance cameras that monitor how often students check their phones or yawn during classes. These gadgets have alarmed Chinese netizens. But schools say it wasn't hard for them getting parental consent to enroll kids into what is one of the world's largest experiments in AI education. A program that's supposed to boost students' grades while also feeding powerful algorithms.
为了就是国家的这个研究呀、发展呀，我觉得是没有问题的。
The government has poured billions of dollars into the project, bringing together tech giants, startups, and schools. We got exclusive access to a primary school a few hours outside of Shanghai.
同学们早上好。
To see firsthand how AI tech is being used in the classroom. For this 5th grade class, the day begins with putting on a brainwave sensing gadget. Students then practice meditating.
现在想象我们眉心有一点柔和的光芒绽放。
The device is made in China and has 3 electrodes, 2 behind the ears and 1 on the forehead. These sensors pick up electrical signals sent by neurons in the brain. The neural data is then sent in real time to the teacher's computer. So while students are solving math problems, a teacher can quickly find out who's paying attention and who's not.
说明这段时间他是有点在那走神的。
A report is then generated that shows how well the class was paying attention. It even details each student's concentration level at 10-minute intervals. It's then sent to a chat group for parents.
就是他可以看到每个人的评分。
The reports are detailed, but whether these devices really work and what they exactly measure isn't as clear. We were curious if the headbands could actually measure concentration, so one of our reporters tried on the device.
但我没有感觉自己特别集中。
This is a new technology with still fairly little research behind it.
Theodore Zanto is a neuroscientist at the University of California, San Francisco. He was surprised to learn that this tech, called electroencephalography, also known as EEG, is being used in the classroom on children. It's usually used by doctors in hospitals and labs.
EEG is very susceptible to artifacts. And so if you are itchy or just a little fidgety, or the EEG wasn't set up properly so that the electrodes didn't have a good contact, affects the signal.
Despite the chances for false readings, teachers told us the headbands have forced students to become more disciplined.
上课回答我的问题，就是他们的声音会比平常更响亮。
Teachers say the students now pay better attention during class, and that has made them study harder and achieve higher scores.
上课认真听讲，作业做的基本上是全对的。
But not all students are as enthusiastic. This 5th grader, whom we caught dozing off in class, told us his parents punish him for low attention scores. And that kind of data adds a new kind of pressure for students.
想啊，如果在一次考试全班人都考了95分以上，就你考了一个85，你会不会感觉你有一种
Companies we interviewed said the data can go to government-funded research projects. We spoke to parents who were unclear about where the data ended up, and they didn't seem to care too much. Santos says there's likely no privacy protection at all.
In a classroom, if you're trying to make an assessment of an individual student, you really can't anonymize it.
Experts and citizens alike are sounding alarms about various aspects of the country's huge push into artificial intelligence. These classrooms are laboratories for future generations. And while these new tools may potentially help some 200 million students raise their grades, just how this all works out won't be apparent until they become adult citizens.
So wow, what an incredible video. I had to let that roll all the way through. There's just no way to cut that. But I mean, you're one of the few authors out there who is, tackling this issue from the reverse perspective, not in that it's something you support, but rather something to be very weary of and put your defenses up.
Yeah. I was trying to find. It's no biggie. I was going to show it because they said that. They said, "Oh, it's a new technology." It's another one that's pretty old. So I had a paper there from a guy by the name of Lawrence P. Grayson. Okay, he worked at the Department of Education while Charlotte was there, and he was the liaison with UNESCO. Okay, he'd won awards from the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and he wrote a paper on privacy issues regarding the development of EdTech. The particular, you can get it on my database. If you go to my database, it's a subscription-based database. It's one of the few things I have on a paywall. And you'll get weekly updates with little little articles that sort of just break down what I've uploaded. But in there it's a paper. If you go to Lawrence P. Grayson, I think it's the one at the top. It's a 1978 journal article that he wrote, and in there he talks about EEG technologies, like the potentials for these things, right? I mean, biofeedback is pretty old, right? Like, so I guess when they say it's new technology, I think what they mean is it's like new in the sense that we're going to put it on a whole classroom full of students and take data from it and then use that data to basically guide, educational curriculum. But the mechanism for so EEGs, there's different. So they're like fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, transcranial stimulation. There's different technologies that can get a signal from the brain waves. But those are
actually back a few years back. I had through HeartMath, one of those biofeedback monitors that a friend recommended to me, and I tried it a few times, but I just didn't get much beyond that. And then there was a other biofeedback through an LED kind of glasses for helping induce more meditation, which I tried a few times, but really didn't get into it. So yeah, this stuff is older than we think it is.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I usually clip that a little shorter. It was good to actually watch the whole thing again, because I forgot about the meditation aspect of it, right? Which is another, so you mentioned HeartMath. So that's a product that I mentioned it I didn't even realize that it was from HeartMath when I covered it in my book, but that's so they got two particular products. So HeartMath Inc. and HeartMath Institute. One's a for-profit, one's a non-profit. And then they've got one's called M-Wave and the other one's called Inner Balance. I think they have others, but those are the two that I can think of off the top of my head. And M-Wave has been piloted to help students that have test anxiety. Okay, but I wrote a piece. We touched on the whole Barbara Marx Hubbard stuff that I wrote before.
Right.
And there's a similar type of heart biofeedback wearable developed by a guy by the name of Mikey Siegel. He's out of the Esalen Institute. I think he's got connections to MIT, if my memory serves me. On my Barbara Marx Hubbard article to check that the particulars on that. But his Heart Sync, same idea, just different patent, I guess. He promotes that you could use that for eliciting, like getting everybody in what he call heart coherence at a business meeting. Right. So imagine the director, they come down, hey, they want to tell everybody we got this new DEI ESG policy that we're all going to have to comply with. And you got some people out there like, I don't think we really want to do that. Right. And so, you're going to have this board meeting. Well, before we hear everybody's opinions about this, let's get into heart coherence. Right. So let's get everybody into a more suggestible.
I'll be damned.
Physiological.
I've been at a couple of those meetings, brother. So it's hitting me when you're saying this on a personal note.
Well, it's funny because it builds on, it basically leverages the whole Delphi technique. If you're familiar with the Delphi technique, which was a Rand Corporation sort of conceptualized this. And it's a method of facilitating artificial consensus creation, usually for board meetings at companies or for town hall meetings for policies. And it's the techniques involve ways that to isolate what Charlotte used to refer to as the resistors. When she was doing the Red Cross stuff back in the day. And she would go to these communist countries where, she met people like a woman whose father was a pianist, and they, wanted to get rid of everybody that they thought was smart. And he was a brilliant pianist. So they figured they'd cut his hands off. And another guy who was really smart, they beheaded him and put his head on a pike. And these were the resistors. So Charlotte, when she would go to these change agent meetings, this is the book that they gave her at the first change agent. Oh, you can't see it on the screen there. Right here, the green one. This is when she talks about the green book. This is the Change Agent's Guide to Innovation and Education. A lot of those Delphi techniques are basically in there, right? So they're showing you like, okay, if a individual or a couple people, like, they resist this, there's ways. Ideally, you isolate them, and then you sort of, in some way or another, sort of ad hominem them, right? And then the other thing that you do is you infiltrate. Like if you have a little small group over here that's resisting, like when you break out from the board meeting, you get an infiltrator in there or someone to listen to sort of, right, get an inside scoop on how you're playing the game. But, right, and these are all just basically group psychology techniques, right? But once you add the wearables and get people in their physiological state, their brain waves, their heart rates into a more suggestible state, right, now you're further primed to accept whatever is the indoctrination. So, in the instance of the school, that's to me, that adds a layer of insidiousness. I mean, beyond just the
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I ran sound professionally for 15 years for Fortune 500 companies as a freelance audio tech out of St. Louis, and I can't tell you how many conferences that were, several days long, where a portion of those days would be breakout rooms, and we'd set up the sound for all those rooms, and they would send 4 or 5 groups off in different directions, but they wouldn't say, come back with your own ideas. They would tell them to come back with the best way to get to this.
Yeah.
So the management laid out the goal, and it was up to the breakout rooms and those 15, 20 individuals in each breakout room to synthesize a plan of action to get to the goal that was laid out by the heads of the company. So it was never really let's brainstorm and think of what the best way is. It's here's this, tell us the best way to get to it. And there's so many times I heard the word globalization, probably more than any other word. We're a global company now, global. And that was just the mantra of the day, and still is. But yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and a lot of times, those breakout sessions, that's right. So if they know that 2 or 3 are people, those are going to be the resistors. Make sure he's in this group, he's in that group, and he's in this other group, right? So now they can get together and have a unified front in the group. Then each group also has a person that already has some of the predetermined paths to the goal, and they act like, and they try to interject it into the dialogue in a way where everybody feels like we came up with something that achieved the goal. And so
right.
Phony sense of like Maslowian self-actualization through the basically following the predetermined directives of the company. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, we can go on. I mean, you've got a lot of great points here: compulsory education, stimulus response, educational philosophy, psychology. A lot of these we've covered today in brief, of course, but teachers unions. Oh my God, that's one that we could spend hours on. EdTech, adaptive learning courseware, and this is all stuff that you cover in your book. And prior to that, Iserbyt covered some of this as well. But guys, I recommend that you make sure you take a note of this.
Oh, you got the big one.
If you carry that, I ordered it quite a while back, but
yeah, you had to have. Yeah.
This is a great one, guys. And then we've got John's work here, School World Order. So definitely give this guy a shout. Support his work, because he's one of those mavericks who went through the system, went through academia, but he kept his own mind and is even able to stay working in it, yet turn the magnifying glass backwards and hold the mirror so that the rest of the world can kind of see what goes on behind the scenes. Such an important work you do. And that brings us to our closing segment. I'd love to talk about the solution side of this, because this is where the exploration of consciousness comes in. And it's not just an exploration, but also a study of itself. You know, somebody once said to me, consciousness can't explore itself. And I said, well, of course it can. If an eyeball can look at itself in the mirror, you know, there's just the surface, of course, but there's something much deeper. So we can take a hard look at this, but solution-oriented speaking, I marked a couple places in the book that were just very interesting to me. One MIT professor of physics, Max Tegmark, he outlines 12 possible post-human futures in his book, which are basically all integrating AI except for reversion, where we all go back to a style of living like the Amish. But I would offer there'd be a 13th option, which is to unplug AI and just, you know, use technology as you would a butter knife or a hammer. You can use it to build a house or smash in a person's skull with. It's not the technology or the tool, if you will, that makes something positive or negative. It's the use of it by the consciousness that makes the free will choice to use it in such a fashion. So real quick to go to the solutions, and you basically you covered like corporate charter schools, cognitive behavioral adaptive learning software, transhumanist precision education, post-human AI, ed tech. And then to reclaim our schools and our own consciousness, you proposed a 5-point plan. And that means that translated through your work as local control, public control, abolish psychological education conditioning, digital student privacy, back to the trivium basics, and new curriculum of consciousness studies, which that to me was the one that stood out as the most fascinating. But just why don't you give a brief rundown of how consciousness can play a role in recovering our ability to learn as was the classical method?
Yeah, so, you know, when I wrote the conclusion or the solutions, actually I finished the book and I didn't have that. And my author, Chris Milligan, who, by the way, is the guy who republished Anthony Sutton's Secret Establishment. So the reason that we still have this in print is thanks to my publisher.
Well, that's great. I know he wrote a foreword to your book too.
Yeah, and actually they co-authored this together. So Chris Milligan and Anthony Sutton. There's
wonderful.
Fleshing out Skull and Bones, and it's actually a collection of other people's writings on Skull and Bones. So it's got Chaikin and Tarpley in here as well.
Nice.
But these are two must-haves if you want to study the Order of Skull and Bones. But I digress a bit. But he so he gets to the end of the book and he says, well, you know, you can't just end it here. You know, you can't destroy people's faith and hope in the future because he goes, your book is scary. It's very scary. I guess the word that people might use is like blackpilling, right? Like, and it didn't really intend for it to be that way. I was just trying to, you know, dissect a problem as accurately as possible. But
Sure.
So I'm like, so you want me to come up with some kind of solutions? He's like, yeah, basically. I'm like, okay, well, that's going to take, you know, some time because I haven't thought about it. So in some ways that chapter is the most dense because especially the section on the consciousness studies and the trivium, you know, I was learning a lot of it as I was going, or at least my formulation of how it could be part of a curriculum that could put education off the track of this whole post-human AI ed tech paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the way I sort of came to that conclusion was sort of surmise or what you had just suggested, right? Which is that it's not necessarily the technologies themselves, right? I mean, like we're using technology right now. Technology has been very helpful in me being able to get out, right, the information about the dangers of technology.
Exactly.
Right? And so, but I basically, when I looked at it, I said there's two philosophical problems that propel the this dystopic use of technology. Okay, one, and they sound like opposites, but if I can hazard an articulation, you'll see how there actually are two sides of the same coin. right? So one is a rabid empiricism, right? A materialist, atheist empiricism, where the only thing that is objective or in any way provable or real is the data, right? Is something that we can measure statistically with some form of empirical metrics. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the flip side of that, though, is a rabid skepticism, right? Sort of like a phenomenological approach where essentially the external world, the data, is ultimately actually always filtered through some subjective notion of the self and reality itself, right? So the empirical thread is the one that basically drives all of the data mining, all the ed tech, all the stuff that's trying to measure every biometric and psychometric it can aggregate to come up with this digital psychological profile that will be the real you, that will be controlled in this social credit metaverse digital dystopia. The other end, the subjective phenomenological, is where we get basically the ethos of critical theory and queer theory and things where there is no biological objectivity to the self, let alone the mind itself, right? It's basically you can identify whatever you want, and how you identify is more real than what you can empirically measure. Well, the way the two go together is that if you're using the empirical science and technology to re-engineer, right, the actual physiology of the human being, to merge humans and machines, then you need a corollary of a new paradigm of a priori or metaphysical or consciousness categories to go along with that. In other words, right, you need to make the categories of the mind as malleable as the categories of reality, and they need to both be transmuted in coordination with each other, right? So in the realm of sort of the woke ideology, just to use the queer theory as an example, what they believe is that identity is all performance, right? It's a repudiation of the law of identity in the trivium, right? In terms of the first law of logic. But it's actually a rejection of existentialist philosophy, because the existentialists said that, which they were rejecting sort of the modernist paradigm where they thought that science and reason itself, without any appealing to God or metaphysics, would usher in a utopia, right? And then we found, all the horrors of industrialism and the world wars and things like that. And so the existentialists said, well, all you can do is be authentic, right? But you get forward with critical theory, right, and queer theory, and it's, well, no, there is no authentic, right? You perform a different identity when you're with your friends, when you're with your spouse, when you're with your kids, when you're at work. So everything is just a performance, right? And so both of those two threads go together, which means that if there's nothing objective to your identity, whether right the categories of the mind or the categories of the physical self, then right there's no metaphysical reason why you can't be a machine, why you can't be why there should be a category difference between human and machine, or human and technology, or the physical self and the avatar, right? And so you need these other categories to go along with it. Well, so the only way to undo that, right, or the only way to get us off that track, is to get us back to the study of objective metaphysics, right? That the self, that there is an objective self, that there is an objective physical self, there's an objective consciousness, and that is found, understood, and rooted in the logos of the universe, which is basically if the logic of the mind is the little logos L, it's the logic of God in the universe, big L, and the way that we discover that, or the way that we conform to it and become self-actualized through it, is through the trivium, through the understanding of grammar, logic, rhetoric, right? The ability to accurately name the categories of reality with the categories of the mind, to make them conform, to do so, to use logic to do so in a non-contradictory way, and then using your rhetoric to express that creatively and critically. And so fundamentally, right, it's not just enough to have sort of the classical methodology, but that has to be for that classical methodology to actually hold water. We have to understand that something like the laws of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of tautology. These are metaphysical a priori principles that we have to utilize before we can do any measurement of any data, right? Before we can come up with some sense of a category of identity, right? We have to use those three laws in order to make any coherent sense of anything. And those, we have to understand, those are necessarily metaphysical, and they are objective in the law of the universe.
That's well said. It seems to me that at the end of the day, the machine-minded want to erase consciousness from the whole equation, and that's the danger of it. Interestingly enough, Herbert Spencer, who one could argue was a eugenicist, and my argument to that is probably 98% of all intellectuals between 1850 and 1925 or so were of the eugenicist mindset. Just to not be is like today being someone who writes a book critical of academia. You're in that nutter 10% by most academician standards. But nonetheless, he came around in 1870 and realized that without character building, that mankind his concern was that his soul would be lost in the machine or the cogs of industry. And so it was important to enact an organization he formed that was formed along with others like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Mark Twain, Edwin Markham, who said, "In vain we build the city if we do not first build the man," and also Walt Whitman and other great luminaries were brought together with an endowment from Carnegie himself. Well, the endowment was the loaner of a house, and they would meet at twilight once a week, and they called it the Twilight Club. And interestingly enough, they discussed how to save man's soul from this, the becoming a cog in the wheels of industry, because his mind was literally becoming machine-like. And again, I said certain illuminates among us have the ability to see further down the road, and it's just a matter of how your mind is, geared, and how much of that trivium and quadrivium that you're able to utilize as a working method. But I think his warning holds true still to this day. But interestingly enough, that Twilight Club became what is the University of Science and Philosophy, which Walter and Leo Russell carried on, which is what I was the president of for 7 years. And it lays claim to the founding of the Rotary clubs, to the Lions clubs, the different organizations that were formed to help better the character of man and protect his mind from this machine-like thinking that industry was beginning to turn him into. I mean, they could tell, they saw this, that, without this interjection of illuminaries who wrote what is also known as the Poet's Code of Ethics, which is basically do unto others as you would have done unto you, or what you do to others, the factual interpretation, what you do to others, you do to yourself. So if you're out there dumbing down the world, you're dumbing down yourself as well. And our job as conscious entities is to lift ourselves up. And the more that we do that, the more we self-develop, self-actualize, the more people around us are going to benefit and possibly want to self-actualize as well. And that's, I think, what you're saying in a nutshell there. Different words, but a lot of people, wise people may speak different words, but they mean the same thing. But I think it's a wonderful book, guys. I highly recommend it. It's packed, jam-packed, just like Iserbyt's The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America is packed with citations, with endnotes, with links, with references, and not to mention document after document that shows you where these folks want to go, but also gives you some solutions as to how you can protect your children in this battle, which is for the human mind, in my opinion. And John, just want to say thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. I'd like to turn the floor over to you for any final thoughts and for a wrap up.
Hey, no, just thanks so much for having me, man. It was great meeting you at Cause Fest. If anybody wants to catch up with me and my research and stuff, you just go to the schoolworldorder.info down there, and it's got links to all my social media. I've got a bit shooting a YouTube where I occasionally make video reports. I'm on Twitter occasionally. Not as much as I try to get in there at least once a week, but I found that, being on it all the time, just I had more anxiety just checking it all the time. So I just stopped doing that, which, you might also want to do it yourself. But so go to schoolworldorder.info, and that's where you can catch me. If you want to support me, there's a database subscription, like I said, and it's got a brain database that similar to Richard Grove's, and it's got bunch of the files that Charlotte gave me. So if you want to sort of have a crash course in the history of education and a bunch of rare documents you can't get elsewhere, that's the place to go. Otherwise, check out Unlimited Hangout. That's where I write almost exclusively. And if you just want to pick my brain or give me some feedback, ask a question, send me an email. Again, I try to do a 24-hour turnaround on those, but this is not my day job. So, I might take more than 24 hours.
Very excellent. So great. Excellent. Thank you so much again. And how do people get a hold of you if they want to contact you?
If you go to the website, there's a contact page. It's the email. It's Taoist Professor, Taoist with a T, Taoist professor @gmail.com. You need to get me a Proton mail one of these days and get off the data mining email that is Gmail. Otherwise, like I said, you can send me a DM on Twitter. I get to emails quicker, but the DMs come through my Twitter into my email. So I catch those pretty quick. But again, like I said, sometimes I'm on Twitter here and there. Sometimes I'm off for a week or so. But those are the two main spots where you can catch me. Yeah.
Very good.
Oh, and one more is you can get the book. You can get the book through. There's a link to the book there at Trine Day. If you can go to Trine Day, it's better. But otherwise, you can get it on Amazon.
Very good. Well, guys, support this man's work. He's doing a great job. He's turning the spotlight back toward academia and just bringing you an insider and as well as outsider. Very good balance there in terms of information and things we can do that are solution oriented. So once again, thank you so much, John, for joining me. And we'll have to have you back on. I'd like to get a panel together. Paul Conant, possibly.
Paul, yeah. We met him as well. Yeah.
He was just on with me last week, and
I watched some of that. Right.
Good deal. And I'd like to get Mark Gober on too, who's another academician from Princeton who came out with one view of consciousness and then completely 180'd his view of consciousness. So that might make for a really cool panel, and I'll be in touch about that down the road.
Very cool. Right on.
All right. Well, visit schoolworldorder.info. Great stuff. Thanks to the listeners. Thanks to everybody. I'm going to run an outro, and then I'll catch you around on the other side of that. Talk soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for viewing and for sharing the link to this tech podcast. To find out more about the work that I do, you can visit mattpresti.com. Scroll down to the bottom to view all of my social media links and channels. If you feel so inclined, you may leave a donation through the Cash App by scanning the QR code or using the hashtag $MPRESTI. To contact me, simply reach out through the contact form at mattpresti.com. Thank you so much.